Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Denz, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator with Greater Cleveland Sports Commission. Our mission is to improve the economy and enrich the community by hosting sporting and competitive events. Building off the momentum generated by the 2016 RNC, Cleveland successfully bid on and won 4 major national events: the 2019 MLB All-Star Game, 2021 NFL Draft, 2022 NBA All-Star Game, and the 2024 NCAA Women's Final Four. These events are collectively referred to as Velocity, and they are being leveraged for community benefit. We want to thank our local LGBTQIA experts who are here to share their knowledge and experience with us today. This educational panel will touch on topics that can be explored further in each of the films as part of our Outcompeting film series. We hope you enjoy the event and the conversation that will occur over the next 60 minutes. Without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator today, Ellie Turan. Ellie joined the LGBT Community Center of Greater Cleveland as its new development director in December of 2019. She previously served on the center's board as the chair of the Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Subcommittee. Prior to her involvement with the center, Ellie practiced for 2 decades in numerous industries, including the military, media, finance, and nonprofit. During her time in uniform, she served for 6 years in the U.S. Army. As a bi+ transgender soldier during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era, she hid her true identity under duress of discharge and/or assault. After exiting the military for civilian life, Ellie remained closeted for several years. However, she came out publicly in 2018 while testifying at Cuyahoga County's Ordinance 9 hearings, which extended equal protections to the entire county. A primary motivation for her coming out as a professional was to protest the reinstallment of the military ban against transgender service members. Ellie earned an Associate of Arts from Lorain County Community College, a bachelor's degree in journalism from Ohio University, an MBA from Norwich University, and is a PhD candidate in management and finance from Walden University. When not at work, Ellie is an avid runner, writer, and public speaker. She is most passionate about communicating the language of diversity, acceptance, and understanding. She lives in Lakewood with her significant other, where they hope to raise a family together. Thank you for being with us today, Ellie, and for leading us in this very important conversation. With that, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you to everyone at Velocity and the Cleveland Sports Commission for inviting us to take part in this amazing Outcompeting series. I think that equality in athletics is something that we all collectively are very passionate about and recognize the importance of, particularly at this point in time. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to provide a few introductions to our panelists. We have an amazing panel here today, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes introducing everyone. So, Dr. Bruce Thomas serves as the superintendent of Albert Einstein Academy of Ohio. AEA is a public community school currently with 3 campuses on the west side of Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. Thomas's background includes educational training from Bowling Green State University and Nova Southeastern University. He has participated in postdoctoral training at Cleveland State University and Harvard University. Dr. Thomas's professional experience includes serving as a classroom teacher, school counselor, school administrator, and school superintendent. He describes his current role in education reform as, quote, creating welcoming and diverse campus communities by providing a comprehensive and rigorous educational environment with resources, programming, and support for all students, regardless of race, religion, and sexual orientation across the spectrums of gender and sexuality, with emphasis on intersectional experiences. Welcome, Dr. Bruce Thomas.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Giovanni Santiago, a good friend of mine. Giovanni is a Northeast Ohio-based transgender activist. As the founder of Meta Center, Inc., a nonprofit for transgender and gender nonconforming youth, he focuses on providing them with a safe space, resources, and an education on self-advocacy. As the Northeast Ohio regional organizer for Equality Ohio, Giovanni works tirelessly with businesses, lawmakers, and citizens for the legal rights of LGBTQ+ Ohioans. He has taught workshops across the country at conferences and various universities and high schools. Giovanni is also a disabled veteran of the U.S. Air Force and is responsible for assisting the Cleveland VA in opening the first transgender specific clinic in the country. Giovanni has been an athlete all his life. His love for sports led him to coaching and a job at Nike, where he is the co-chair of the Central Territory Pride Team. He is also a board member of the Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ publication. Giovanni walked the runway during the New York Fashion Week for Dapper Q, showing there's no limit to his ability to make an impact just by being his authentic self. In 2019, he and his wife Elise rode on a float at World Pride in New York for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. Giovanni loves to travel the world with his wife and collect sneakers, which he owns more than 700 pairs of. Welcome, Giovanni. And finally, Timothy Bussey is the Associate Director for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Kenyon College. And they are the college's first administrator to focus primarily on supporting the needs of the LGBTQ+ community on campus. Additionally, they are among the inaugural cohort of facilitators for the NCAA's first LGBTQ+ inclusion program, the NCAA Division III LGBTQ1 team program. In this role, they facilitate LGBTQ+ inclusion trainings for athletic departments across Division III athletics. They also serve as both a vice president for the board of directors of the Newark, Ohio Pride Coalition and the executive director of a newly developing organization, ACE and Arrow Alliance of Central Ohio. Previously, they served both as the acting operational director of the Newark, Ohio Pride Coalition and a visiting assistant professor of women's and gender studies at Kenyon College. Timothy, welcome. Okay, so now that we have assembled our awesome panel, I'll open it up with a few observations, and then I'll turn the conversation over to the panel. Athletics is probably one of the most fundamental aspects of humankind. So, you know, looking all throughout history, some of the earliest cave paintings represent physical athletic competitions among our early neighbors in this world. Throughout the centuries, wars have been stopped and started because of athletics. Sporting competitions are a way for human beings to assert our place within a town or a state or a nation, and most broadly as members of humankind. In fact, many anthropologists agree that athletics represent one of the fundamental aspects of being human. So having said all that, we're having a conversation today about equity and inclusion in athletics for the LGBTQ+ community, particularly surrounding the culture that's there along with the legal landscape. So starting with Timothy, how do you feel, what does the current legal landscape look like for LGBTQ+ athletes?
Yeah, so the current legal landscape is a bit tricky, frankly. Right now we have pretty much every major athletics organization has some type of comprehensive policy that does allow for trans inclusion in sport. So if we look at like the SAA, the NCAA, and the IOC, or the International Olympics Committee, so they all have pro-trans inclusive policies that have been set up, which do formally allow for trans folks to compete in sport. But the legal landscape, especially for trans rights, and I'm sure most of the folks on the panel certainly know this, and probably honestly most of the viewers of this are well aware of this too, but that legal landscape is really ever shifting. So, you know, while we do have these really proactive policies at really all of these levels of sport, ranging from, you know, collegiate athletics here in the US with the NCAA, all the way up to international athletics with the IOC regulations, we are seeing a lot of challenges. And one of these challenges is certainly, you know, here in Ohio, we've had introduced in the state legislature bills that have attempted to ban specifically trans women from sports, and the logic there being that trans women have a quote unfair advantage, even with the current regulations that are set up by organizations like the OHSAA, the NCAA, and the IOC. We've seen that, it didn't pass here in Ohio. I don't think it actually even made it out of committee, if I'm not mistaken. And Gio, I'm sure, okay, Gio's shaking his head. But, we are seeing these attacks happening all across the country, certainly. It was actually just a little bit more than a month ago that I believe for the first time ever, we actually had a sitting US Senator who came out as the lead sponsor of essentially the same type of bill that we saw here in Ohio, and saying that she wanted to introduce this in the US Senate, which would affect the legal landscape all across the country should that end up passing. And currently only one state has really been successful with passing one of these anti-trans bills in terms of regulating sport, and that state is Idaho. And the sort of fear, I guess, for advocates for LGBTQ plus and specifically trans inclusion in sport is that we are seeing, we've seen one of these pass, and we have a bill that's a sort of special interest project of a U.S. Senator, Senator Kelly Loeffler from my home state of Georgia, that largely mirrors that bill in Idaho. And so the fear essentially is, with this legal landscape being sort of ever shifting, that we could very easily see a situation where a very radical bill like that one that passed in Idaho could pass in the U.S. Senate. And to be just kind of clear, radical, I'm calling it radical, and that's not to be alarmist. It's to be realistic. The Idaho bill allows someone to challenge someone's gender either before a competition, during a competition, or after a competition, and radical in terms of how invasive this is. It allows for or creates a situation where someone who has been accused of being trans, essentially, has to prove their gender. And the bill stipulates the ways in which someone would, quote unquote, prove their gender. And that's through either a hormone test, a karyotype, which is a test of your chromosomes, or an examination of your external genitalia. So I'm sure that later on today, we're going to have a very thorough conversation about why all of those things are problematic. But I don't know if we want to pass it over to Gio for maybe some Ohio specific information. But I can keep going on that. I have lots of thoughts. So don't hesitate to call on me again for that one.
We certainly will. But yes, Gio, why don't you expound your thoughts on the legality? So Timothy referenced it's a trend that we're seeing among a lot of anti-LGBTQ groups this is kind of in line with previous attempts we've seen in the past, right? Like we saw the bathroom bills at first, and we've seen a lot of things in the medical space that would prevent LGBTQ people broadly and trans people specifically from receiving full medical care. Now we're seeing this kind of entering into the arena of sports. And it always, I've been kind of watching these things for a couple of years, and it's always like the same premise, right? It's always the premise that if trans people are afforded full access to society, then society is going to crumble, right? That's like what we keep hearing, right? But these sports bills in particular, could you give us some background in terms of, what is the current legal, what are the current regulations, and then what would some of these proposed bills do in terms of eroding rights for trans people in sports?
So honestly, Timothy covered it pretty closely. There has not really been a lot of change outside of Idaho, but at one point there were 24 anti-trans youth sports bills just floating around across the country. And it's important to note, the common theme around that was mostly geared towards trans girls playing sports. That was really the stickler for a lot of them. Obviously, they wanted to blanket it and just say trans youth in general, because that would make it easier for them to not have to go back and try to fix it later. But the main targets were trans girls that were playing these sports. And that's because there was an uptick in them winning, but also in them losing. And that was not a part of the conversation. But the most important thing to note with that is we got very lucky with COVID. And I say that because there's not been a lot of luck from COVID, but COVID stopped a lot of these bills, because then a lot of these states had to shift to their COVID relief thinking and had to worry about that. So we did see a stoppage in that from Ohio and a number of other states. And so that is something positive to look at with this situation, because then that gives us who are kind of on the defense with that a little bit more time to really rally the troops and spend some more time educating individuals. And so community members and the sports committees and also our state legislators, because we know that we see this all the time, and it's like, but save the women, save the kids, and that's not really what it's doing. And so what would happen is, just as Timothy said, that it would be so invasive to have these children, because they are children. We're not talking about professional sports at this point. And even at the collegiate level, they're adults, but they're still children in the respect of they're in school, but it's really these high schools. So you're telling me that it's a good idea to have a 12-year-old high school kid have to show you their genitalia just to play a sport? It baffles me. And so really our thought process with that is like the repercussions that could come from that, and the legal cases, who's getting sued, what does this look like, what type of harassment then comes after that. And so then what happens if this child is proven not to be trans? What does that do to them mentally, and socially? So really thinking just past the whole, well, I have to show you a document that says I'm not trans, or I have to show you my body parts to say that I am or not trans, like the mental, that comes in that, and the social that goes with that. And so really just taking a hard look at how structurally, in a society, this would put us back so much further if we really start to let some of these come through. And I think that was why a lot of people really converged in Idaho when it really started to move there, and Chris Mosier, who is a famous trans athlete, who's a runner, who made history with the Olympics, and he really was very, very in Idaho, fighting on the front line, standing on the steps of the State House, and really saying this cannot happen. And so really seeing that happen, I think kind of motivated a lot of other individuals to start to look into what their states were doing and say, okay, this cannot happen. And so thankfully Ohio didn't get that far, but we're not out of the woods yet. I don't put anything past them, and so we have to still stay vigilant, because we know we want to totally get it squashed.
And I guess just to add on to kind of what Gio was saying, we've also seen sort of some additional challenges with this too, because, during the Obama administration, Title IX was read to be trans inclusive. And that was one of the, if I'm not mistaken, actually one of the first sort of pro-LGBTQ plus policies and interpretations of existing policy that the Trump administration rolled back. And actually now it's been going on for, I think, about a year now, but there's been a concern in the state of Connecticut where they do have statewide laws and statewide policies that do actually explicitly say yes, trans inclusion is a part of sort of our goals for Connecticut schools for K through 12 and also collegiate education. And there's been an issue where there were a couple trans women who were playing high school sports and ended up winning. And we had someone who lost to them basically question their gender and say, I don't think it's fair. These two competitors are trans women. And, that person ended up filing a Title IX complaint. And so we've seen now in the past year or so the Department of Education at the federal level has now escalated that to the point where they're actually threatening to withhold school aid, so financial dollars from the federal government to Connecticut state schools, because the state of Connecticut has said, no, like just because someone is a trans woman doesn't mean they can't compete in women's sports. And we kind of have this showdown right now between the state of Connecticut and the Connecticut governor and Secretary Betsy DeVos, representing the US federal government. So we're still seeing this kind of stuff evolving at this point too.
Yeah, thank you for adding in on that. And so these are some very good points, right? Because, a lot of these bills that are being put forward under the premise that they're protecting the children, right? Like they're being put forward as some kind of measure that's needed. But any serious attempt to kind of think through the bills really shows, as I think Gio exemplified, that a lot of these bills could be really hurtful, particularly for young people. Dr. Thomas, you've dedicated your career toward, help safeguarding the youth and helping them to develop academically and socially and personally. What's your thought on this? I mean, what would be the ramifications of a child really having to go on trial effectively for their identity just to be able to partake in sports? And what impact would that have on their ability to connect with their fellow classmates athletically? And what kind of measures can be done to kind of reverse that ostracization of trans youth?
Yeah, I'll tell you, school's hard enough as it is for kids. So making it harder makes no sense to me at all. Before I get on to that, Ellie and Joe, I want to thank you for your service, your military service. That's awesome. And Timothy, I want to tell you, I could listen to you talk all day because I learned a ton of stuff already that I'm writing down here. So I'm very, very happy to be here. As the oldest person on the panel for sure, I look all the way back to Renee Richards, and that name may not be familiar to all of you, but she was a transgender tennis player years and years and years ago, a physician actually, and there was a whole bunch of controversy around that when she appeared on the pro tennis tour. And I look at our kids now and I think of all the social emotional stuff that's going on for everybody, for all children. And I think of sports as a very organized social gathering in most circumstances for kids, which is necessary for appropriate development. And disenfranchising anybody from those opportunities is certainly detrimental to their development. But as schools, we have a responsibility beyond math, science, social studies, and language arts. And some of us take that more seriously than others. Some people are really focused on the test scores and how that lets their district be positioned in the state of Ohio and across the country. And others of us look at things like teen suicide and social and emotional development for children to learn the skills necessary to problem solve, to critically think, to do all of those sorts of things. And the sports is a big piece of that. Now, community schools are different, and some of you know this too. Our kids participate in their districts of residence. So if a youngster comes to us from, Lakewood City Schools, they participate in the band or football or whatever in their district of residence. So we coordinate with them, not only that the students are academically qualified to play and eligible, but also the other pieces of transitioning them from our learning environment to theirs, which are completely different, absolutely completely different. So our obligation is beyond just the teaching and the learning, but it has to do with appropriately supporting our students having access to those organized social circumstances that exist, clubs, sports, all those things. And to be honest, it's a chore because people don't see people don't see clearly the benefits of including everybody in the activities that some of us do, and they would rather just not see it because it causes them to expend some energy on something they probably would rather not.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. And, you know, it's kind of, it's interesting. It's interesting you would say that, but it's also very true, right? I think there's a certain aspect of we'll open up the conversation to LGBTQ athletes in general, but just kind of taking a little bit more time to focus on trans rights in athletics, because I think this is a focal point at this moment. You know, for me, you know, as a trans woman, I'm watching this debate unfold, and you know, it's difficult to watch on two fronts for me. You know, because one, as a trans person, you know, I'm hearing these debates that are being put forward that you know, would take away my rights and the rights of other trans people and gender nonconforming people from competing in athletics. And the arguments that are put forward are, you know, unfair and inaccurate, right? So, you know, the notion that a trans woman is biologically the same as a cisgender man, well, we know that that's not true. We know that there's a patchwork system in place in terms of regulations, depending on what the governing body is. But the general premise is that, you know, there has to be some kind of transitionary milestones along the way. You have to have been typically you have to have been on hormone replacement therapy for about a year. Sometimes they throw in surgeries or different things, you know, depending. But, you know, these proposed bills that would effectively block trans people from competing as they identify, these are like blanket bans, right? Like these aren't contingent on any kind of like medical or transitionary metric. It's just like a blanket thing. So, you know, for me, that's difficult to watch, but at the same time, you know, this is also happening in this kind of broader intersectional debate regarding women in athletics broadly, right? Because I think one thing everyone can agree on over the past couple decades specifically is that, you know, female athletes have really broken so many barriers over the past recent years. Like, you know, the Williams sisters in tennis. You look at the U.S. women's soccer team and all of the championships they've won in relation to the pay disparity that they're experiencing with their male colleagues, right? You see things like American Ninja Warrior, for example, where you have female athletes competing alongside male athletes. And a lot of times you're seeing, you know, particularly with people like Jessie Lebrec or Jessie Graff, like a lot of these female athletes are really excelling, right? Then this is despite the assumption that a woman wouldn't really be able to compete with a cisgender man. And so there's this big broader movement toward gender equality in sports that's really asking, like, why are sports segregated by gender anyway? And, you know, is the segregation really in place to protect women's sports, or is the segregation there to really disenfranchise female athletes from equal pay, right? So, and then in that debate, then you have the trans debate being kind of superimposed in the middle of that, whereby, you know, the trans community, you know, I feel almost is being used like a pawn kind of in this broader debate. What are your collective thoughts on that? Timothy, why don't we start with you, and we'll just kind of do like a round robin in that broader intersectional lens.
Yeah, I guess like kind of thinking, you know, about other examples of like sort of gender equity in sport. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're 100% right, Ellie, with, you know, drawing attention to the fact that, you know, there are lots of other sort of gender disparities in sport. Like the one that immediately comes to my mind is, again, U.S. women's soccer, and thinking about the pay disparities that exist there. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, you know, this whole debate over, you know, oh, well, we need to not include trans women in sport. I mean, a lot of this is really based on this sort of notion of like the trans boogie person, you know, and it's kind of like you said with, you know, a few years ago we had all these bathroom bills popping up all across the country, and now we're seeing the same thing with these. Often they're called like Save Women's Sports Acts or Fairness in Sports Acts. So they're seemingly something that like it sounds like, yeah, I agree with that. Like I care about women's sports, but you know, I think at the end of the day, like there are a lot of sort of challenges related to sport, and there's a lot of debates that folks are having right now about really the role of kind of social justice more broadly in sport. I mean, we're seeing this particularly with the uprisings this past summer, and sort of the ways in which athletes are also continuing to use their platform, and also now more athletes even using their platform in sport to draw attention to social injustice, and particularly racial equity. And, you know, I think that this is something that we're not going to see go away anytime soon. I think we're going to continue to see athletes using their platform to advocate for social justice issues. And, you know, this isn't something new. I think that sometimes when we hear folks that are, you know, upset that we have athletes speaking out about social injustices, you know, it often comes from this mentality of, well, you just need to do your job and you need to play and entertain me. And I want to watch the sport and I don't want to have this sort of social justice messaging around it. But the reality is that like sport has often been a place historically where conversations about social justice and contemporary sort of issues really take a forefront. You know, and I think, for instance, of the very historical example, and this person obviously has a connection to Ohio, but I think of the very historical example of Jesse Owens. I mean, like that is very specifically, like if you think of Jesse Owens and the 1933, I believe it was, Olympic Games, like that was a person using their platform to not only showcase their athletic ability, but also to really send a very clear message about a social justice issue. So this isn't something new. Like this is something that we've seen, and I think we'll continue to see. And you know, I think really it's essentially sport is so much a reflection of what's happening in society, that I think it would honestly be kind of silly for us to expect to be able to engage sport and not to have some of these sort of moments of social justice coming into it. And I know for me, like even this past summer, like seeing sort of the policies that NASCAR was setting up about banning Confederate flags on their racetracks across the country. I mean, that was huge. Like as someone who grew up in the Deep South, you know, that was something that you're very used to seeing, especially in terms of like associations with like some fan cultures and some subsets of fan culture for NASCAR. And that's huge. So I don't think that we're going to see this type of stuff going away anytime soon is the short version for me.
I think it's interesting and very important that you've placed the issue of trans inclusion in athletics in context to America's history with segregation in sports according to race, right? And I think you know, like as I've seen a lot of this unfold over the past years, one thing that I struggle with is like how very obvious the historical parallels are and how a lot of Americans don't see that, right? Because, you know, we've talked about the bathrooms before. We talked about the bathrooms in the 1950s regarding whether or not our Black and brown neighbors should have access to bathrooms with white people, right? We've had the conversation about athletics and, you know, whether or not we should have a separate league for Black and brown athletes, right? You know, what are our thoughts about this? You know, is this an example of selective amnesia on the part of America? Do we not want to remember all of this, or is this an attempt by a lot of the anti-LGBTQ groups to consciously conjure up these divisions? What are your thoughts on that broader context?
I would jump in and say it's not selective at all. It's 100% a conscious effort to ignore. And it goes back to what Timothy was saying about the value essentially that Black and brown people and LGBTQ individuals hold in this country. And it's just shown as less than, so a lot of people don't know, they talk about the conversation with the kneeling for the anthem and all of that, not knowing that the national anthem didn't even play at sporting events nationally for many years. And it was a ploy to get individuals to join the military. So once again, it was about upholding, this supremacist culture anyway. And so then when people were like, we're not going to do that anymore, it was seen as this thing that was like, you're so unpatriotic or you don't care about your country. And it's like, okay, first off, it's a song, so it's not that deep. But more than that, it was something that you used for capitalism anyway. So really trying to think a little deeper in these things. And so even a step further with that, it's like, well, Black and brown athletes, like as Timothy said, you're just supposed to play the thing. We don't want to hear you talk, just like what did Tammy Loren tell LeBron? Like, shut up and dribble, like seriously, that's what their framework is in their minds. And so it's very conscious because these things aren't slip of a tongue. They are finding verbiage that suits their narrative. Nobody's just slipping of the tongue saying just shut up and dribble. That's not a thing. So you have to take the time to be intentionally negative and disrespectful and degrading. So it is all about holding the power for them. They don't really talk about, like I said, trans men and trans boys in sports because they feel like cis boys are already going to have the upper hand. That's not really a conversation to have. Trans girls and trans women, they feel like because they are men, as they say, have the upper hand on cis girls, which we know that is, not necessarily true because it goes back to genetics regardless. And so you see that, and you see the disparity in these conversations, and there's no way to not think that it's intentional. I mean, it's just, even if you don't know all of the facts, there's no way to say they're not intentionally or willfully being ignorant to or purposely hurtful, because Google is a fabulous resource and it's free. So if you don't understand something, if it's something you're like, this is not something we've experienced in our state or in our community, you find ways to find that information and look it up. So if you're not doing that, you're not doing it because you don't want to.
Mhm.
I would be happy to jump in and actually agree with Gio, because I think some people like inequity. It makes them feel good. It makes them feel better. It makes them feel more powerful. So they don't tolerate it, they embrace it. And it's part of who they are as people. High school sports in terms of gender equity, it's a strange thing because if you're at a school that has a boys tennis team and not a girls tennis team, and you're a girl who plays tennis, you can play on the boys team. You're allowed to do that. But you can't do the reverse. If the boys don't have a team, the boy can't play on the girls team, which I think is interesting. And even further in OHSAA, if you have a girl who's really good and and there is a high school team, she can petition through the school to play on the boys team and take a spot on the boys team, which is very controversial. Because it's not based on the skill level, it's based on gender, which is absolutely absurd. Conversations about gender neutral sports at the OHSA level occur occasionally, but they are thumped down in a matter of seconds because no one wants to talk about allowing kids to be on mostly single participant sports like tennis, golf, those sorts of things. But why wouldn't it be okay to have a volleyball team that has boys and girls on it? I mean, what's the difference? If they play volleyball, they play volleyball. But the OHSAA lives in that world of division and of equity differences. I can remember being a coach years ago and watching the boys basketball trainer cut off the tape on the boy's ankle with this really nice, stainless steel, made for doing that. And I was the girls coach, and they gave me this thing that it was like cutting it off with my, an old shoe. And when I went to the athletic director and said, I'd like one of those, they were like, no, you don't get one of those. that's for the boys team. Well, girls athletes, are they not as, important as the boy athletes? And again, if I got a girl player on the basketball team that's really good, why can't she play on the better team if there are two teams available? So the OHSAA has done this for a long time and really struggles with the differences in making it equitable for both genders.
Mhm. I think, Dr. Thomas, one thing that you said that really resonated with me is the fact that not everyone disagrees with inequity. A lot of people do embrace it, right? For whatever reason, maybe it makes them feel better in some way. And much of the inequity that we see broadly in society, specifically in athletics, hinges back to explicit and overt attempts to change either the law or the regulation or something along those lines. But then a big part of it, I think, that often gets overlooked is the culture that often exists within sports teams that could potentially prevent an athlete from being their true selves, even if a ban doesn't exist, right? The Major League Baseball player Billy Beane often talks about the complete dearth almost of any out athletes in professional athletics. If it's professional baseball, football, basketball. I think it's something along the lines like you can count on one hand how many athletes in those leagues are actually out. LGBTQ broadly. I'm not even talking about trans people specifically. I'm saying like, if you're gay, if you're bisexual, if you're a lesbian, we're not seeing those stories. And it really almost begs the question. And I'm going to ask you this one, Gio, because of your military experience. Does it seem like professional sports is in a kind of don't ask, don't tell culturally?
Absolutely. And even more than that, if it is known, it just kind of depends, A, on the sport, and then B, on the team, and C, on the person. And I say that because, you think about if, overarchingly, we know plenty of out women's soccer players, Megan Rapinoe. Then you think about, women's basketball. We know plenty of out women's basketball players, Sue Bird, who the two of them announced their engagement. So super awesome. Congrats to them. But it's not as necessarily frowned upon, and then you have someone like Dwight Howard, who is a professional NBA player, and it was known that he had an interest in trans women, and it was like they drug him through the mud, and so it just depends on so many different things, and it's frustrating because it shouldn't have to be that, but we see it, and we see this huge disparity in it, and it's like, how do you work to fix that? How do you work to change that? And so it is very much, don't ask, don't tell. And I was at the Cleveland City Club last year when Billy Beane came during the All-Star break, and he spoke, and being able to listen to him speak and talk with him after, and just to see how it hasn't changed from when he was playing, baseball and having to live closeted to what it is now all of these years later. So it's very much like that don't ask, don't tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think whether it be legally or culturally, I think one thing we can all agree with is that being LGBTQ in sports is hard, right? So to counter all of that and to really build up our youth in athletics, and we'll start with you, Dr. Thomas. And then kind of going around the group, what supports exist that are available to high school and college students that would help them to really bring their true selves to the game?
Yeah, and I'll let Timothy and others speak to the college piece. In terms of K through 12 athletics and different organizations, the internal support systems are so different based on the district that you're in and the emphasis of that district on the social emotional health of the students, the children. It varies, and some people just don't care, to be honest with you, and just don't do a thing about it. They live in a different world where, it is what it is, and these kids can do this and these kids can't, and these kids can do that and those kids can't. Um, Other places work hard to provide support systems for working with students who can go through the NCAA clearinghouse, who are talented athletes looking for money on the way to college, regardless of their sexuality. And other places don't. It's a matter of the emphasis that we have on the importance of that social emotional piece, which includes athletics. So at Albert Einstein, that's a big piece for us. So we have kids who, again, a little more complicated because they have to participate in these activities in their district of residence. So now I'm dealing with an athletic director or a superintendent of schools who just doesn't get it and doesn't care to get it.
Mm-hmm.
So the struggle there is how to get around that, how to move that youngster in the right direction, regardless of those obstacles. And some do, and some don't understand, but they want to understand, and they're much easier to work with. So we have a lot of support, counselors, specialists, whoever we can gather within our district to provide that kind of resource for these student athletes. But it's a struggle, and I'm hoping Timothy has better advice and better experiences as the kids move on into higher education. But I think in the K-12 model and with the OHSAA the way it is, it's very difficult for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in terms of college and sort of collegiate sport, definitely there are still challenges for many LGBTQ plus athletes. I don't want to sort of paint this rosy picture that there's no challenges that exist for these student athletes, but there are a lot of additional supports that have developed, particularly in the past couple of years. So kind of like holistically in terms of like higher education, a lot of campuses do have, offices that deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion in some form or fashion. Sometimes they operate under very different names. And kind of like the position that I have of really working on LGBTQ plus inclusion, there have been some colleges that have had positions like that since the 90s. There are still lots of campuses that don't have someone that does the type of work that I do. But those types of positions are becoming more and more increasingly common. I kind of think more holistically, we have seen a lot of productive changes, particularly with the NCAA. So we've had, a very sort of pro-inclusive transgender participation policy at the NCAA for several years now. But I think that something like the program that I facilitate for them across the state, so that NCAA Division III LGBTQ1 team program, stuff like that is really indicative of a much sort of more positive shift in college athletics. So that's the first LGBTQ plus inclusion training that the NCAA has offered, and it just launched. I'm trying to think in my head of when I got trained because I was in the first group of folks, but about a year and a half ago. And the really kind of cool thing about that is that it's available to any D3 school, so any school in Division III athletics. But it ended up actually the NCAA created that training because coaches, administrators, and folks all across the country involved with Division III athletics were specifically saying, hey, we need to do better. We're having more LGBTQ plus student athletes that are wanting to compete, and we need better tools to support them. And so the NCAA did this large nationwide survey and then found that LGBTQ plus student athletes were saying, it's not that I'm fearing that there's outright discrimination, but I do think that more stuff needs to be done, that we need coaches, we need athletics administrators that better know how to support LGBTQ plus student athletes. And on the kind of reverse side of that nationwide survey of D3 coaches and administrators, The coaches and administrators that didn't identify within the LGBTQ plus community said that they actually wanted more specific action items of what are specific things I can do to do better by these student athletes, to create a more inclusive athletics environment. So I think that the fact that we have folks all across the country that are leading college athletics and that say, I want to do better, I want to better understand how to create a supportive environment, that's huge. I think that I would love to see something like this come to like Division I and Division II athletics. And it only exists in Division III, this particular training program, because D3 asked for it. But I know that at least through my kind of connections, I've met folks with D1 and D2 athletics that are interested in having a kind of program like that because they're seeing those challenges too. So I think those are really solid trends that are suggesting like we are sort of on that upward trajectory. And ultimately, I think that's the space we're trying to head towards, is making a more inclusive and more equitable environment for all of our student athletes. And then definitely at certain institutions we see some of these changes too. Like I'm thrilled that Kenyon has not one but multiple gender neutral locker rooms, because not even thinking about just students participating on formal teams, but thinking about folks that just want to come down to the athletic center and work out, and maybe play like a friendly game that's not part of a team or a competition or anything like that. But I'm really happy and thrilled that we have a space that is gender neutral for our non-binary community members, to be able to also sort of feel that, yeah, this is a space for me, like this is a space where I can come and participate too. So I think we're going to see more and more sort of stuff like that over the next couple of years.
I think that was very hopeful, and I think that I'll leave the last question in toward hope, because I think we always need that. Dr. Martin Luther King once said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends to the path of righteousness. At this particular juncture in America, it's really easy to not be hopeful right now because, it just seems like everything's going wrong, from the environment to democracy to everything. Yet we always have to believe in our neighbors and their capacity to do the right thing, even when they often don't, right? Looking at American history, it's replete with mistakes and wrongs and grievances all throughout the centuries, yet somehow in all of it, we always have to strive to make something better. Do we as a panel believe that our fellow Americans will embrace the course of righteousness, or do we think not? What are our thoughts? Gio, I'll start with you.
I'm gonna say I'm in the middle on that, and that is because I feel like the youth will, because they get it a little quicker, they understand, they care a little less about those things. But as long as we have people with those ideologies still making the decisions, so whether they're the athletic directors, the principals, the coaches, the state legislators, we're not going to move forward. The parents, because we know oftentimes the kids don't care, they just, feel like they lost. They just lost that race. They got, and their parent is like, well, you lost because of X, Y, and Z. And then, then it becomes something. So until we get, past that with those individuals, which I'm not sure we ever will, we won't. So I'm in the middle.
What about you, Dr. Thomas? What's your thought?
Gio, I think that was very safe of you. Nice call there. Being in the middle. I don't know. I think I'm a little more hopeful. And we talked about the professional athletes using their platform to express their opinions, and I think we all have a different platform. And those of us who believe we have an obligation to social justice, we take our platform and we have these conversations when we can, even when they're uncomfortable, even when they're someone would say they're not appropriate, but we have them anyways. And I can't help but think, and again, be hopeful that as we continue to have the conversations, more people have them, and then more people have them, and then more people have them. I could be completely wrong, and I'm in my own little world here, so I see what I see. But I notice our students, one of our core values in our schools is to teach our students to advocate for themselves and for others. And we talk about that a lot. You don't sit back and take it when it's wrong. You stand up for yourself and you stand up for others, neighbors, classmates, acquaintances. You stand up and you have your opinion be heard. So I'm hoping that's the case. I don't know, when they leave our K-12 environment, I'm not sure sometimes where they land and how they land there, but I hope they land in a good place and they're able to advocate for themselves and for others.
And I guess kind of my final thought on it is I'm super hopeful. I mean, sometimes I get down and I'm kind of thinking like, oh gosh, things are real rough. And certainly there are rough patches. Like I think of that bill being sort of propped up by a U.S. senator. That kind of blew my mind. But I am really hopeful. I mean, for Gen Z, so a lot of the students that are sort of in that traditional age demographic of college, and traditional being air quotes, of course, they are more and more identifying with labels in the LGBTQ plus community. They are thinking about their identity a whole heck of a lot more than probably folks in my generation did when they were, 16 or 17. I think that we're kind of seeing a lot of sort of positive trends there of them wanting to sort of better understand and be more empathetic to a variety of people's experiences. I mean, I was telling folks I did some AP grading over the summer, and it was all sort of essay grading for current high school students across the country. And I was blown away, like the amount of folks that were doing sort of research projects on social justice issues, and not just social justice issues related to like the LGBTQ plus community, but thinking about racial justice issues like mass incarceration, thinking about issues of climate change, and doing research on how to sort of combat these things. I'm pretty hopeful. I'm pretty hopeful that we have a really engaged generation that wants to see the world do better and be better. And I'm kind of hopeful that we're gonna be on that upward trajectory.
Well, thank you for that. And with that, I just want to thank everyone on our panel today. I think it's been a really wonderful conversation and a very critical one right now. And so with that, we'd like to turn it back to you, Rachel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ellie. I would just like to echo your thoughts. It was a wonderful conversation. We really appreciate everybody's time, your expertise, sharing your knowledge and opinions with our audience. So on behalf of Greater Cleveland Sports Commission, I'd like to thank you, Ellie, Gio, Bruce, and Timothy for your time today. We hope everyone watching enjoyed the panel. Thank you.